Great. So today is the second of our two classes about the Romantic era. And in case when this whole thing started, you thought, oh, 8 classes seems like a lot. You might be thinking now, because this is how I feel. I'm like, 2 classes is not enough for me to get through the entire Romantic era of sort of the piano repertoire. But I'm going to do my best to at least talk about a few highlights beyond what we talked about last week. Let me start by showing a picture here. This is a picture not depicting something from the Romantic era, but there we go. So this is a painting of that's depicting Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia at one point, who is and that he's playing the flute. Apparently he was an accomplished flutist, and that was something important to him. And sitting at the keyboard is C.P.E. Bach, one of J.S. Bach's sons, probably the most successful of his sons in a variety of ways. And so this was the kind of typical, well, I don't know typical, but this was one form of the way that music would be heard back in those days. This is in the sort of mid 18th century, or like around the early 1700s, mid 1700s. And as you can see, although there is an audience, and it certainly looks like a very nice place to be, there are probably just as many people performing in the concert as in the audience. In other words, it's a small audience. This is because Frederick the Great almost certainly could just say, well, I want C.P.E. Bach here, and I want these musicians here, and I'm just going to pay whatever it costs, because he had all the economic opportunity to be able to do that. So that's the way many musicians, as we've discussed before, like Haydn was supported that way, Bach, J.S. Bach, Scarlatti, most of the musicians that we think of from that time period had some kind of one or more sponsor who was extremely wealthy, an aristocrat of some kind. For reasons that I don't really know, and maybe some of you do, but if you don't bring it up now, we'll talk about it later. For whatever reason, the economy kind of shifted in Europe around the time that we think of as being the Romantic era in music, sort of, around the beginning of the 1800s, where there was more and more economic power to the middle class. There was a larger and larger number of people who had a reasonable amount of money, and fewer of them that had ridiculous amounts of money, if that makes sense. So the musicians, for example, some that we'll talk about today, were being supported more by large groups of people who would pay, for example, for tickets to a concert, as opposed to small numbers of very, very wealthy people who had, for example, Haydn or C.P.E. Bach or whomever on their payroll. So as that sort of situation changed, it opened the door, or perhaps necessitated a musician being more of a kind of, the way we think of nowadays, more like a kind of like a rock star, where because they are really popular, and whether that's for a good reason or not a good reason, but they're popular, lots of people go to their concerts, and that's how they were supported. So one of the first examples of, in fact, really the first example of a big giant star of classical music in the way that nowadays in some ways is like a rock star, was Liszt. So I'm going to start by talking about Liszt, Franz Liszt. And in fact, there was a movie, I don't know if any of you have seen it, it's a very weird movie, and it's not a historical movie, it's not a documentary. It's from the 1970s, directed by Ken Russell, called Listomania. And the movie has it's a totally bizarre movie, really. I mean, I don't know if like being on drugs is required to watch it, but it seems like that's how it was made. So there's a lot of things. It basically takes as a point of departure some of the aspects of Liszt's life and greatly exaggerates them. And then Wagner is in the movie, but Wagner is a vampire and he comes back from the dead. So anyway, it gives you an idea. It's not, but in fact, I'm going to show you a picture, just one more photo here. The main character, the character of Franz Liszt, is played by Roger Daltrey, who was the lead singer in The Who. So just to give you, and also, I think I can't remember if this is before or after Tommy, but anyway, in any case, that was the kind of image of Franz Liszt that that director had. And so there's some truth to that. Liszt was very, a big star. People kind of went crazy when he played because he was an amazing performer. Unfortunately, we don't have any way to hear him now. There weren't recordings in those days. But in fact, there's a lot of other aspects to Liszt's career besides being a great virtuoso. And I don't mean to suggest anything to denigrate him at all by being that, but he did a lot of things in his life. And so what I wanted to start by doing is to talk a bit about Liszt. I'm sorry, I have to get the document here. And so, by the way, we're going to be talking about some composers, and we'll find out which ones in a few minutes. But the first one we're going to talk about is Liszt. He was born in what was then a part of Hungary, or I should say, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So nowadays, that town Reiding, which I've never been to, it's a kind of a small town, is, I think, officially in the boundaries of Austria. But Liszt always seemed to think of himself as Hungarian, and that's important in a way because one of the aspects of his career as a composer was writing music that celebrated the music from, or the way he saw it, celebrated music from his own country and from his own culture, something that he could share with audiences in other places who might not be as familiar with it. And those pieces in particular, there's a list there of pieces, the list, he wrote these 19 Hungarian rhapsodies. And those pieces really, from his point of view, were a way of sharing his culture, he thought, with the audiences that he would play for. And those audiences were all over the place, or I should say all over Europe. In those days, traveling around Europe was already a big deal. So, so Liszt as a musician, one of those facets was that he was this incredible pianist, and he wrote a lot of music that for himself to play. In fact, in later years, when he had more or less retired as a performer, he ended up revising many of the works he had written earlier. Liszt's pieces are famous for being difficult, but they used to be a lot more difficult than they are now because he realized he was the only person capable of playing it. So he would kind of make it a little easier. And believe me, still, they're incredibly difficult pieces, many of them. But he needed to make it a little bit more like human level. His reputation is that he was the greatest pianist ever. Unfortunately, we don't know, we can't confirm or deny that because we don't have recordings of him. And unfortunately, there is, of course, a tendency in the Romantic era, everything got sort of exaggerated. So it's hard to know, but apparently he really was a stunning musician. Fortunately, we also have the music that he wrote. He spent obviously years and years writing music, and besides the pieces that are on this list here, I have to tell you that he probably wrote, and I have to tell you, I'm not 100% sure of the number. I'll tell you why in a minute. He might have written more than 500 pieces of music. Not all piano music. He also wrote a lot of orchestral music and things of that nature. But part of the reason it's hard to count is that he did often revise his pieces, and sometimes he would revise them so substantially that it really became like a different piece. So in any case, he was extremely prolific. And among the things that I want to draw your attention to on this list of pieces that I think are worth your getting to know is that he spent quite a lot of his time and energy arranging music by other composers for solo piano. For example, Wagner was his son-in-law. Wagner married Liszt's daughter, whose name was Cosima. There's a lot of drama there, but anyway, I'll leave out the soap opera for a minute. But just to say that he was a great friend and actually relative of Wagner's, and so Wagner, of course, being an incredible composer for the opera, the thing is that in order to have an opera, you had to have probably hundreds of people. First of all, there were people on stage, there were people in the pit, there were people backstage. There's a huge staff to mount one opera. And in those days, if you were going to hear any piece of music, whether it was an opera or something else, you were going to hear it live or you weren't going to hear it at all. There were no recordings of any type. So hearing an actual Wagner opera was a rare experience for any audience member, even if they lived in a big city like Vienna. So Liszt helped to promote in a certain way and share with audiences that music because he would take that music and arrange it as a solo piano piece. Obviously, it loses a lot. For one thing, if it's an opera, you're missing the words. And he would take sort of his favorite scenes from that. And that's how a lot of people got to know that music, a lot of audience members. And of course, another pianist would also be able to play those pieces, but it was easier to hear them that way. Likewise with the music of Schubert, who, as you recall from, I think we talked about this just last week, was famously not famous during his lifetime. And it was, and in no small part thanks to the efforts of Liszt, that his music was introduced to a wider audience, not only by playing it as written, but he also took some of very really great pieces by Schubert, but for example, that were for voice and piano, and he arranged them as a solo piano piece. He also made it into a kind of a virtuoso vehicle for himself or for another pianist performer. But it was a way of introducing Schubert's music to a wider audience. And so Liszt really was extremely generous. Played a large role in helping the careers of many other people. Basically, he used his celebrity, which was vast, in part to help other people and to really say, you should get to know the music of this less known person than me, being Liszt. Among the solo piano works of Liszt, it's really there's so many great pieces, but the number one piece, probably if you ask most musicians and pianists, if they say what is the greatest piece by Liszt, it's the second thing I wrote there. It's the Sonata in B minor. So I'm telling you that because we're not going to listen to it now. It's a half-hour long piece, but I would, if you are not familiar with Liszt, or maybe you think like, I don't know about Liszt, he's no Chopin. It's true he's not Chopin because only Chopin is Chopin, but that Sonata in B minor is an unbelievable piece of music. Liszt at an earlier stage of his life, when he was primarily busy as a performer, I think sometimes he wrote pieces kind of quickly, not super carefully because he was very busy. Traveling, for one thing, was a lot more time consuming in those days to get from place to place, and he was busy touring as this virtuoso pianist. He also had to practice in order to play, so he didn't have as much time for composition. Some of the earlier pieces that he would maybe end up revising later, or sometimes he didn't revise them, they're not the best pieces. But the Sonata in B minor and some other important pieces come from the period of time after he had basically retired from the stage and thought, okay, I want to write music as well as I possibly can. The Sonata is one of those pieces. Another group of pieces that you may not know, but are absolutely worth your getting to know, are these pieces that are the années de pèlerinage, the years of pilgrimage, I guess. That's another from that phase after he had finished his career basically as a performer. It's the list of Liszt pieces is too long to narrow it down to anything. And in fact, I want to take a brief moment, and I hope this works okay. I'm going to show you a little video that you won't get to know Liszt's music very well, but it gives you maybe a little flavor in a somewhat exaggerated way in the video I'm going to show you of what maybe it was like to be in a concert played by Liszt. This is a movie, and I have to tell you, it's sort of a cheesy movie must be from the 1960s or something like that, if not earlier, from the Soviet Union. It's all in Russian, so we're just going to watch a little portion of it where somebody is portraying Liszt in this particular scene. And just to set the scene a bit for those of you who don't speak Russian, which includes me, is that what's going on is some people in the audience are going to put pieces of music into a bowl, and then he's going to choose one and he's going to improvise on the theme, that he feels he most wants to do. The reason I want to show you this video is because it does show some stereotypes, probably not unfair, of what Liszt was like, what he looked like, and some of the exaggerated mannerisms that I don't think were probably the way Liszt looked, but it's his reputation. The pianist who's in this movie portraying Liszt is Sviatoslav Richter. Richter, it's a funny choice because Richter, I mean, to a fault, was extremely serious, almost too serious. Like, I sometimes wonder if Richter had any sense of humor, and a fantastic pianist. But it's funny to me to watch him here where he's kind of overacting. So I'm going to try to show you a bit of this clip. I have to tell you, I taught this same class last night, and I had a little technical problem. So if you don't see the video on your screen in the next 30 seconds, somebody try to get my attention to tell me, because I let it play for a while without realizing it didn't work at all last night. So let's hope I have better luck now. that happened before too. All right, so sorry about that. So what I want to do next is to talk a little bit about a composer who was quite different in his, hmm, in some ways, basically, from Liszt. Maybe there were some similarities as well, and that's Johannes Brahms. So the thing that is most strikingly different is that Liszt really was, in some ways, a very modern musician. Modern in the way that we think of now. For example, I said he was a little bit treated like a rock star. Um, he had this kind of rock star kind of, or at least it was perceived that way, kind of lifestyle. For example, he was, rumored to have all these illegitimate children from different women. That's not really the case. He had, I think, one child, and it was with, everybody knows who the mother was. The issue was that that was a very long-standing relationship that he had with that woman, but they weren't married because her, I can't remember, she was a noblewoman, and her husband would not grant her the right to get a divorce. So, but she and Liszt lived together for years. It was just, legally speaking, they couldn't be married. So anyway, but that was sort of Liszt's reputation that way, and perhaps the reason that he was portrayed in that film called Listomania years later. Brahms, on the other hand, was kind of, there was nothing boring about his music, but he was kind of not a very interesting life. He was very quiet life, just, lived alone, wrote music. He had, just as everybody else does, he had, successes and failures in it, both in his professional and personal life. But Brahms was seen by most musicians of his time as being quite old-fashioned. It's something that doesn't matter to us now because we just think it just sounds like Brahms. But basically, he didn't really break new ground in the same way that some other composers like Schumann and Chopin and Liszt did. He was writing in a certain way in the same style as Beethoven. So, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment. But I'll tell you that when he first, his first symphony was premiered, he wrote 4 symphonies. There was a review, in a very famous review that some critic wrote, that referred to Brahms's first symphony as Beethoven's 10th. And that sounds like it should be a compliment, but it wasn't intended as a compliment. It was basically saying, why do you need to write music like this when everyone else has moved on and started writing a different style? What's the point? And so Brahms, rather than trying to be, you could say he wasn't trying to be original. You can immediately tell it's Brahms. He has his own unique voice, but he wasn't trying, and he tended to write in these classical forms like sonatas and theme and variations and these things that I've referred to, although I'm sorry I haven't gone into a lot of detail what that means, but that Brahms didn't see a reason not to write in the same basic form that Beethoven had written it. He also wrote a number of pieces which were specifically paying homage to earlier composers. For example, on that list of pieces you can see there, I wrote that some of his important pieces include variations on a theme by Handel, also variations on a theme by Paganini. And there's other pieces where, in a less obvious way, he is sort of paying tribute to earlier composers, particularly of that classical and sometimes Baroque era. As I wrote there next to the picture, he had in some ways the opposite kind of problem that Schubert did. Schubert was unfortunately died unrecognized. Brahms was recognized as a great composer almost immediately. When he was in his 20s, he had a huge success on more than one front. One was just in a professional, among great musicians. Robert Schumann had written a famous article that people heard about, saying everybody's got to get to know this guy Brahms, who he had just met. And he's like, this is a genius. And Schumann was right. He was absolutely right about that. But the other thing was that Brahms wrote some pieces, the Hungarian dances, which were originally for piano 4 hands. They became arranged for orchestra. They became arranged for every combination of instruments because they were so incredibly popular. Everybody wanted to have a way to play that piece somehow, so it would be arranged for their instrument. He became so well known from that so early on that for the rest of his life, he had that kind of burden of high expectations. Basically, he always lived up to everyone's expectations. If I had to name the 5 greatest composers, that if that was all I was allowed, then he's definitely one of them. But the thing is that he was very hard on himself. And one thing that he also was well aware of is that he was going to be looked at and scrutinized in the future. It wouldn't have surprised him at all in the year 2020 that we would be talking about his music and about him as a person. So he was very careful to destroy anything that he didn't want people digging up later. And mostly I'm talking about like pieces of music that he wrote that didn't quite turn out the way he hoped. He put them in the fireplace. He didn't leave them in a drawer for someone to discover later, or even sketches of pieces as he was working on them. The working process, we have almost none of that with Brahms, because he would take his sketches and throw them in the fireplace to make sure that no one could see. Maybe he started out with kind of a stupid idea, and then he's like, oh, let's try that again. Let me work on this. Whereas with some other composers, Beethoven in particular, there's a lot of sketches. They're totally illegible, but some scholars can sort of figure out what Beethoven's process was. Brahms didn't want anyone to see any of his dirty laundry. And in his personal life, one of the rumors, might be true, it's certainly a very famous rumor, but I don't know if it's for sure if it's true, is that Brahms had some kind of romantic entanglement with Clara Schumann. Um, I don't know if it's true, it might be. But in any case, at some point after things, even their friendship, unfortunately, sort of cooled off later in life. And Brahms at one point asked her to send back to him all of the letters that he had sent to her. Now, of course, these are in the days before text messages and phones and things. And so there was this hard evidence of whatever he said, which was in the form of a letter he had sent. So all these letters, and for some reason, I have to say, this is surprising to me, she agreed to just send it back to him. So, and then he promptly put them in the fireplace because he didn't want anyone reading whatever he wrote to Clara Schumann. So he was very aware of his reputation. Um, Brahms wrote incredible music in every form that he touched. Um, but one of the things in particular, he was such a great composer of works for orchestra, and I'm including in that the piano concertos. So we're going to listen to a little bit of the one of the piano concertos. Brahms, one thing he had in common with Liszt is that he was a great virtuoso pianist, and that was how he first really made his big splash. Is that people heard him play, and so as was really the case for a lot of musicians in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, they were composers, they were also performers. There wasn't such a big division as nowadays. It's become a little bit more specialized. So you can imagine, I'm going to play a little clip of this, and you can imagine Brahms playing it. I hope this one works. If you can do the same thing, and let me know if it doesn't work, and if that's the case, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but last night it worked. So let's hope. What I'm going to play for you is a little bit of the second movement of the second concerto, a very stormy and dramatic movement. The performer here is Christian Zimmermann, is the pianist, with Leonard Bernstein conducting. So let me see if I can make this work. Um, okay, well, let me talk about a few other things, and then we'll have some live music at some point by me. But in the meantime, one thing that I would like to do and is to talk about as best I can a whole bunch of composers. And in fact, let me just show you what I'm going to do. What I did is I did something very subjective. I took some of the composers we don't have time to talk about in any detail and said, in my opinion, what the number one piece you should get to know is, if you want to get to know their piano music at all. And some of these are like very obvious choices, I have to tell you, and some are more subjective, like other people might choose different pieces. But so since we don't have time to go into any particular detail of these specific composers, I will mention, I did mention Mendelssohn, I mentioned his existence last week, but I didn't say anything. There's more choices that could work for Mendelssohn, but these pieces called the Variations Sérieuses, serious variations. That's a particularly substantial and important piece by Mendelssohn that shows a lot of what made him great. By the way, when you hear that piece, you'll absolutely hear sort of echoes of Bach, among other things. It also just sounds like Mendelssohn's own voice, but Mendelssohn, as many people did, had a real reverence for Bach, and he was very, you may already know this, he was a real key figure in bringing Mendelssohn's music, bringing Bach's music to the public. That musicians knew about Bach, but the general public didn't. And part of that is because until the 19th century, people didn't really listen to old music. I don't mean that every piece performed was always a world premiere, but people would listen to the kind of music that had been written fairly recently. So during Mozart's time, they didn't really listen to Bach. And during Bach's time, they didn't really listen to like Palestrina. That started to change in the Romantic era, and that Mendelssohn was one of the people responsible for that, that said, you know, this guy, Johann Sebastian Bach, you should get to know his music. And lots of other performances started to happen which are more like what we have nowadays, where a concert might include pieces that are relatively new and might include pieces that are old. That's more typical of a concert program that you hear nowadays. For example, at the San Juan Chamber Music Festival, if we were having one, you might hear newer stuff and older stuff. And so but that didn't really start until the Romantic era. By the way, that does connect to what I said about Brahms earlier, about how Brahms was throwing out all of his sketches and throwing out all the things he didn't want people to find. It's because Brahms was living in a time when people were interested in history and musical history. And so he realized, wait a minute, that's going to be me later. So, and Brahms himself was extremely interested in in the music of earlier composers. So that has partly to do why he was conscious of that. But anyway, Mendelssohn, there's a lot of Bach, you'll hear it when you listen to Mendelssohn. Now, Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky wrote a lot of great music. He's primarily known, well, first and foremost, as a composer for the ballet and maybe opera and symphonic music. He didn't write a huge amount of piano music, but the Piano Concerto No. 1 is an incredibly well-known piece, and with good reason. Mussorgsky, Pictures at an Exhibition. I know that I've played that in Uray, and I'm trying to remember how recently, but it was a few years ago by now. But in any case, so Mussorgsky lived about the same time as Tchaikovsky in Russia. And the two of them, in some ways, are like the two representatives of different facets of Russian culture and society in the middle of the 1800s. Tchaikovsky, by and large, you could say this is a very much an oversimplification, but it's kind of like the music of the czars. You imagine St. Petersburg and the beautiful Hermitage and all of and the ballet and those kinds of things. That's kind of like Tchaikovsky's music. Mussorgsky is more the music of regular people, peasants and farmers, and that kind and sort of Russian folklore is kind of a big part of Mussorgsky's music. That particular piece, Pictures at an Exhibition, is a very interesting piece. I don't have time to really go into all the details about it, but it's an incredibly vivid and imaginative piece that uses specific paintings by a totally obscure painter that you would never have heard of except thanks to Mussorgsky, but he was a friend of Mussorgsky's, and that he sort of portrays through music. And the piece is actually better known at this point as a orchestral piece, which is Ravel, about 70 years later, made a orchestral transcription of it, which is probably played more often than the piano version, but it's originally a piano piece. I can tell you that the performance I wanted to share with you was from the Tchaikovsky competition. There was a documentary made. I'm going to say this is probably like 30 years ago now. With Barry Douglas, was an Irish pianist who won the Tchaikovsky competition, which is held every 3 or 4 years in Moscow, playing this very Russian piece in front of a very Russian audience. This Irish guy, and they were like, "Wow, he understands Russian music better than we do." But in any case, that's one of many great performances of that piece. So Ravel was so captivated by it that he decided to make it into an orchestra piece. But there's lots of other people who also arranged it in different ways, including I'm forgetting the name of them. It's a kind of a progressive rock band from the 70s. It's not. I'm gonna think of it later. But anyway, so many people have been so captivated by that music. I'll just say that much. So I hope you get to know that. With Edvard Grieg, who's from Norway, he wrote a number of short piano pieces, called it lyric pieces. But probably the best, definitely the best known piano piece by Grieg is his Piano Concerto No. 1. I also want to make sure that you don't forget about the existence of of a few great composers from Spain who lived in the. Oh, that's it. Thank you, Sarah. That's exactly right. It's Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. Yeah, I kept thinking Crosby, Stills, Nash. That's not them. I had the wrong three. Well, and then there's Young. Okay. Anyway, so but anyway, Granados, the piece called "The Maiden and the Nightingale." It's from a larger suite called Goyescas. That's probably, if you have old time to listen only one, that's the piece I would choose. And then Albéniz, he wrote a lot of pieces which um, you know right away that the composer was from Spain. He tries in many ways through the sound of the piano to evoke the sounds of things like the guitar and castanets and things that are like very specifically Spanish sounding instruments. Now, I want to draw attention to the fact that in Mussorgsky's case, in Granados and Albéniz's case, perhaps in others as well, they shared what I mentioned about Liszt earlier, its sort of interest and desire to share the music from their country, their home country, and sort of make sure that audiences in other places in the world could hear that. So they would take maybe folk music and elevate it in some way, but use some of what are sort of typical sounds of music from their country and put it into this sort of more art music. That was a thing that you hear a lot more. It's I wouldn't say that didn't happen ever before the Romantic era, but it happened more during the Romantic era. There are many examples of people who are just wanting to write music that sounds like it came from somewhere else other than where the audiences happened to be. Um, and so, as I said before, that when we looked at that painting last week, was it this Death of Sardanapalus by Delacroix? Um, there's some interesting things that just come from faraway places. And the world, in a certain way, was starting to, I don't know if you would say it was expanding or it was getting smaller, but in any case, people were becoming somewhat more aware of um, some other cultures besides their own. In particular, the sort of dominant musical culture in Europe was still centered around places like Vienna and Paris and other parts of Germany and Austria and France and Italy to some degree as well. So anyway, those are the sort of, if you like I said only have a few minutes, those are the ones you should listen to. The last composer that I'm going to talk about is probably the one that you're like expecting me to get to of the most is Frederick Chopin. Um, and so let me just pull this up so we can look for a moment. So more than any other composer, Chopin is like the one we associate almost, it's like that's the sound of the piano, is whatever Chopin sounds like. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that first of all, he wrote uh, brilliantly for the instrument, but it's a good thing because he almost exclusively wrote for the piano. Every single piece that Chopin wrote includes the piano, and almost all of it, I would say 95% or more, is for solo piano. Um, that's I can't think of another composer who was quite as fixated on one kind of music, and that's just was how he felt comfortable. I think and they felt like that was his voice. He was, of course, himself a great virtuoso pianist in the same way, and probably in the same category as Liszt. I don't know which one was better, or in any case, Liszt was the one who everybody paid attention to. Part of what hampered Chopin as a performer was that unfortunately he suffered throughout his life from very poor health. Um, I think he had tuberculosis and other kind of related lung issues, and he unfortunately he died rather young as well. You can see he was, I believe, 39 when he died. So that made it hard for him to perform, to travel, to do that much. He did some, but not nearly as much as, for example, his friend and colleague Franz Liszt was able to do. Um, and so one of the things about Chopin, I have to say, that's hard for me to even say why. Even I'm not sure what all the reasons are. But when I hear Chopin's music, I often, first of all, it's immediately recognizable as Chopin. But the other thing is that I don't hear where it came from. There's nobody who sounded like anything like Chopin, I feel like, before Chopin. You know, I mentioned that Mendelssohn, he has his own voice, but there's you can hear him referring to Bach. You can hear Brahms sort of paying homage to Beethoven at times. And even Schumann, for all his originality, also does things that are rather like Beethoven at times. But Chopin, he just sounds like nobody else. And I don't know where it came from. It's hard for me to say. He just absolutely had his own original voice. Some of that is you can actually describe in some ways, which is that he, like many of the composers I just mentioned a moment ago, took music from his own country, his home country of Poland, and wanted to create music in that same voice and to share that with a wider musical audience. And so among the pieces that he wrote include pieces called with the titles Mazurka or Polonaise, and those are specific Polish traditional dances that Chopin um, wrote. He wrote a lot of pieces in that form. He also pioneered some other kinds of music which no one else had written before. For example, ballad. A ballad is just sounds like it's some kind of poem. And those pieces, although they don't have a specific story, despite the title that makes it sound like they have a story, a ballad or a poem, um, the idea is that it's kind of structured the way that like a story or a novel might be structured. Um, I mentioned a couple, it was last week, that Schumann wrote a lot of pieces that were inspired by literature. I didn't mention it so much, but also Liszt wrote a lot of pieces inspired by literature. For example, he wrote a piece called the Dante Sonata, which is inspired by Dante's Inferno. And a lot of other examples besides it. But so Chopin also, in a somewhat more abstract way, inspired by the form of literature. Um, and so what I want to look at here down below is these are the most important pieces that he wrote, and it's actually I didn't leave out a whole lot. He wrote 2 piano concertos. He wrote a whole lot of other pieces. Um, One thing I want to draw your attention to are those preludes. Um, it's a prelude. Um, I suggested up above in the paragraph above that he pioneered the prelude. He didn't invent a prelude. People have been writing preludes for hundreds and hundreds of years. But usually what a prelude is, it precedes something else. That's what the word prelude means, a prelude to another thing. But Chopin said, I'm just going to write the prelude, as if they're basically little fragments, offering the possibility of something that you never even hear the rest of. And he wrote these somewhat sounding fragmentary pieces. That idea of writing these short glimpses into something is, I'm sorry, I don't have an example to show you, but there is a parallel in the visual arts, which is that during the same period of time, the Romantic era, a lot of painters loved to paint ruins, as if there's like, oh, this is unrealized possibility. This could have been a great castle, but now it's just a bunch of rocks with trees growing over it. So that fascination with that is a little bit connected with this interest in composers sometimes writing what seem like fragments or sketches, like a quick glimpse. One of the forms, as I said, that Chopin wrote in that was specifically Polish was the Polonaise. And so what I'm going to play for you in just a moment is one of the best known of the Polonaises. It's Opus 53, A flat major. It has a nickname called the Heroic Polonaise. And as with many pieces by Chopin, lots of people have attempted to say what the story is behind the piece. And this is one of those pieces that people say, oh, well, it's clearly about all of the war and revolution going on in Poland, and the reason that, unfortunately, Chopin is a patriot, he couldn't move back to Poland. I don't know that Chopin was thinking about any of that stuff, but it all sounds good. It's even more universal than that. It expresses a lot of very wide range of feeling. But one of the things that you always hear in a Polonaise is this rhythm. That's sort of a typical feature, and you'll hear that throughout the piece. And I guess that must have been some part of how that relates to how the dancers dance it. I've never seen what a Polonaise looks like when dancers do it, but that was the basis for this piece. So I hope that my technical problems with Zoom are done for today, because what I'm going to do is the thing I've done before, which is switch devices. That's going to take me about 60 seconds. You've all seen me do this before. Let's hope it goes smoothly, and so you won't see me or hear anything for about a minute, and hopefully I'll reappear on the other side. Okay, I'll be back. Okay, do people see me and hear me? Okay, so far, the one thing I've done right on Zoom here so far today. So now I just need a couple minutes to get set up so you can see. Okay, so confirming one more time. Everybody can hear me and see me. Great.
Thank you, Mac.
Thank you. So I'm a little out of breath. So anybody else wants to talk, go ahead. This is good, and I apologize that we had so many technical problems with the Zoom today, which we're going to have to sort out some other time. But I'm very happy to take any questions or comments about anything. I know we had to kind of rush over a lot of stuff, so you might have questions about stuff we talked about today.
Max, I'll go first.
Sure.
2 quickies. Number 1, what was the piece that you played when you won first prize at the Dublin International Piano Competition? And number 2, do you really have to have large hands to be able to play Liszt?
Okay. I'll answer the first question first, which is that you have to, most big international competitions, you have to bring about 2.5 or 3 hours of music that you're playing, because the first round you play a recital program, the second round you play a totally different recital program, third round you play a totally different recital program, and then the last round is usually a concerto with the orchestra. So I had to play a lot of stuff. It included the Liszt B minor sonata that I mentioned today. It included the Chopin 20th Prelude. It included Rachmaninoff's second concerto, a lot of other stuff. So there's a lot of music, and one of the challenges about that is that in order to have even a chance to be the winner of a major international competition, you have to be playing everything the best you can possibly play it, and that's a lot of music to prepare. So that was a challenge. Do you need to have large hands to play Liszt? Yeah, it probably helps. I haven't noticed it as much with Liszt as with some other composers like Rachmaninoff and Prokofiev, where that really creates problems for people with small hands. It probably helps. I mean, Liszt definitely had big hands. Chopin, for example, did not have big hands, but one thing that's different with Chopin is that he seems to have had extremely flexible hands, because he just writes things that seem to require that. And that's also, by the way, assuming that they wrote music that suited themselves, and I think it's a reasonable assumption that they like to be able to play it themselves well. So you do sometimes get a little glimpse of like what they were good at. I have to admit, I haven't really noticed so much because I have big hands, so I don't really notice that. I only notice when there's a problem. So it's sometimes like if I have a student and there's some music they can't reach very well. So.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Bob, I've heard that Rachmaninoff had particularly large hands.
Yes, yeah, he's famous for that. Yeah, and that like way more than anybody else. So there are places where it's the rest of us, even though I have big hands, I have to figure out how to deal with some stuff the way that he wanted it.
Go ahead, Sarah. Max, as a child when I was a child, I took a lot of ballet, and I can never hear any Chopin without immediately going back to bar and floor and all the exercises. And one of the schools I studied with, they actually had a live pianist playing. And it was interesting because you played that almost with ferocity. And when, that isn't the way it's normally played when ballet students are, because you want something more measured, but so it's really exciting to hear it very voluble. So thank you for that.
Well, sure. So I have a couple of comments about that. One is that, Chopin, it's interesting that Chopin is absolutely the soundtrack of ballet class, right? Everybody thinks, oh, you. And he wasn't writing for the ballet because ballet barely existed. But I mean, and there is a ballet that uses Chopin's music, or they said,
Chopiniana.
Sort of carried the stuff or collected the music and put it together. But the thing about that is that I think there's a reason for it, is that very often Chopin's music seems to suggest a kind of weightlessness, and that's that you're trying to achieve in ballet, the illusion of or lack of gravity. So there is that. I will also say that Chopin, there are a lot of sides to Chopin's music, and one of them absolutely is the kind of extremely delicate and refined and sort of inward. And I think sometimes people, however, forget that that isn't the only side of Chopin. That there's also there's also great strength. And I think sometimes people think that way because as a person, as I said, in his sort of physical being, he was unfortunately rather sickly. That's just, unfortunately, that was his situation. But that doesn't mean like he was that way in here. And actually, Schumann had an interesting way of describing Chopin. Schumann said Chopin is like a cannon hidden behind the flowers. And so I think maybe this piece, the cannon's more obvious than the flowers, but there are other pieces where it seems mostly to be flowers. But it's absolutely, there's a kind of something behind it all the time.
Well, Chopin, with all the emphasis on the Polish dances, it is very dancey music. And dances typically have to have a rhythm that you can follow and anticipate. So thank you so much for that exciting presentation of that piece.
Thank you.
Valid.
Okay, I had a question. Just as a pianist, and we've seen you playing this kind of a piece where we get such a kick out of the piano almost going out of tune while you're playing it so difficultly and hard. Do you have favorites of Chopin that you would choose to play, or is it all in your mood or in your choice?
Well, whatever I'm going to play, part of it is that I have to plan in advance. I can't just suddenly play something without practicing it. And so that's part of it. So I have to, whatever. I usually try, if there's like a whole program of music, to find some variety, but also some connecting ideas between the pieces as well. So with all that in mind, at some point I plan what I'm going to play with that in mind. And I do also, to be honest, just for my own personal enjoyment and growth as a musician, I like to play different things. So this piece is not brand new to me, but I learned it since being in the sort of we're not exactly in quarantine, but since my life, all of our lives changed significantly, we didn't go out as much. So in other words, when I stopped having to go to school in person and started teaching online, so this was a piece I was like, I've always wanted to play this piece, so I'm going to learn it. That's usually the reason that I learn a piece, is I feel like it. I have to say that if I didn't make a list of the #1 piece by Chopin, right? I didn't include it because that seemed unnecessary, but because there's a lot of very famous pieces, of course. But I would say that if I had to pick one that is going to be less known to you guys in the audience, that you should know, because there's a lot of that are not as well known, but the best less known piece to you is the Polonaise Fantasy. That's my recommendation. If you don't already know it, the Polonaise Fantasy. There's also a lot of other very frequently played pieces that are worth hearing too. But that's one. That's maybe one of Chopin's absolutely greatest pieces, but isn't played as much because I think it's a little bit less over the top showing off. And a lot of the time the audience likes that, and it gets a lot of applause, and then the person gets invited back for next season. So those are the kind of pieces that get played a little more often.
Is that to say, if you were to choose one as your favorite, would that be it, or is it also good that you don't choose?
I can't. It's like I only have 2 children, but I don't have a favorite. And imagine if, but I don't have a favorite Chopin. It's not because I don't like any of them, it's because I like so many, and so I can't choose one. Okay. I know it's a frustrating answer. People ask me that, who's your favorite? I wish I could tell you. But.
The question I have is, you're at home now. Is it easier to find these numbers because you just pull up on an iPad? And how has working from the iPad changed your way of living?
It's not that it was difficult for me to find the music I needed before. I have a lot of printed music on my shelf that doesn't come off the shelf that often these days. Yet, so the iPad has been a great help to me. Certainly, if I'm in my house, it doesn't really matter as much. But if, let's say, you're away from your house and you say, "Oh my gosh, I forgot to bring this music," you can get it on the internet very quickly. It's also everywhere you go. I can have every piece that I need with me in one device that I put in my, in my backpack, rather than have to carry a lot of music, through the airport, et cetera, et cetera. It's also helpful that, for example, that sometimes either I will be playing something, or maybe a student wants to play something for me that I don't know, or that I don't have the music for, and they can just send it to me, like, right then and there. So it is very, very helpful, I have to say.
Max, as the artistic director for our festival, and bearing in mind that there's you and a trio and a quartet, is it you who chooses all the pieces, or do you get input from the other musicians?
Wait, both. I get input from them and then I choose. So yeah, I do try to like think about what other people, first of all, what they want to play, and second of all, what maybe they're good at. I think about that a bit, but and then I try to fit that in with some scheme. And then usually when I do talk to the musicians, I also already have some concept of like where I would like the basic ideas of what I want the program to include. And then that sometimes informs like a question, like, do you have a piece that would make sense for this theme? That's usually how it goes.
Max, is there a particular piece of music that you don't know right now, but you want to learn as soon as you can?
Yes, there's too many of them. There's tons. And I have to tell you that one has to look for silver linings these days, of course. But I've been in this sort of situation where all of my concerts were canceled. Almost all of them were canceled from about March on, and the result was that I had all of a sudden all this time to practice things that I didn't. There weren't the same kind of deadlines where you play something that you know really well and focus on getting ready for a performance. I could, in other words, learn a lot of new pieces. So this was one of those pieces. This was one of the pieces that I learned that was new. I've been working on all of the Bach partitas. I had played one of them, but I hadn't played the other 5. So I finally on the last one, just trying to learn those. So there've been a lot of pieces actually. So what's the next thing on my list though? It's very hard to choose, and actually that's been one of the problems. I have to commit myself to something, that I'm going to, because it means I'm not going to work on something else. I think, so the piece that I've been working on a lot already that I'm going to play some of next week is a piece by Prokofiev, the Sonata Number 6. I want to learn the Sonata Number 7 by Prokofiev as well. I don't know, I cannot choose. It's too many. But there's a lot of pieces I haven't played, and I have to tell you that when you're a pianist, this has been my career for a long time. And if I'd been playing another instrument, not every other instrument, but for example, basically anything other than the violin, I would probably have played by now all of the repertoire for my instrument. If I were a violist, cellist, clarinetist, flutist, bassoonist, it's not because they don't have music to play, but they don't have nearly as much as pianists. So as a pianist, I'm always having this feeling that, oh, I don't know this yet. Oh, I don't know that. And so, sometimes people will be surprised, like, you've never played that? I'm like, yeah, but I've played like all these other things. It's like you just cannot do everything when you play the piano. Yeah. So basically, that's a good problem to have because we have such an enormous repertoire that we have a lot to choose from. But sometimes it feels like, oh, I want to do it all. So I'm sorry, I didn't really answer your question, but there's a lot of things I want to play. What do you think I should play?
I think, oh boy, you know a hell of a lot more repertoire than I do.
Yeah, anyway, there's just so much great piano music. I mean, and it's literally, I think I mentioned this in our first class meeting a few weeks ago, is that if you add up the repertoire for all other instruments, solo instruments, it would be less than the repertoire for just the piano by itself. And so, we're very, very spoiled pianists. Okay. Well, any other questions for today? So what I'm going to try to do, if I can remember, Heather, you might need to remind me, is I will send a link certainly for that one particular video that was a kind of amusing one. I want to make sure that people have a chance to see that if they want. Next week, we're going to be talking about the beginning of the 20th century. And I think I have to tell you that, so I taught a similar class to what we're doing now, but it was over the course of 4 semesters at Boston Conservatory. More than 10 years. Piano literature class, and I have to tell you, my favorite class was basically the one where I introduced music from the 20th century. So I hope that you'll be able to come with me and see what everyone was trying to figure out what they wanted to do next. And the world was changing, and what were they going to do about it? So we'll do that, and I'm going to play something by Prokofiev next week. Okay. So if that's it for today, again, I'm going to have to figure out what I'm doing with Zoom and why all of a sudden I don't know what I'm doing. Hopefully I'll be able to fix that problem for next week. And
No, for his.
She's like,
No, I mean, if she
Thank you,
has.
Max.
okay, good night. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Yeah, thank you.
yeah.
Thanks very much. See you next week.